Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting MoonBlink webinar. My name is Travis Hawthorne, and I'm MoonBlink's marketing coordinator. And today we are joined by Bob Finch. Bob is president of Select Spectrum, which provides transaction advisory and consulting services to entities seeking to maximize the value and utility of FCC spectrum licenses. From 2003 to 2008, he was the VP of Spectrum Development for Nextel and Sprint Nextel. And today he will be taking you through a variety of topics related to licensed spectrum for wireless broadband, specifically related to the 2.5 gigahertz band. And before I hand it off to him, let me just introduce you to who we are. MoonBlink is a value-added distributor of wireless and video surveillance equipment. We pride ourselves on having a very knowledgeable sales and technical team that can assist with any wireless or video surveillance projects that you might have. So if anyone has any product inquiries or looking for some guidance on your network, MoonBlink is here to assist you. So with that, Bob, I'll let you take it from there.
Great. Thank you very much, Travis, and thank you to the attendees for joining today. I'm going to start out by wishing you bonjour, since it is, first of all, the French Open is well underway at the moment, and it's also the anniversary of D-Day, the liberation of France. So we thought I'd just honor that to start. I've also probably exhausted my knowledge of the French language with that. So this discussion today will cover a number of topics, put the overall agenda up here in terms of what's going on in licensed wireless, and I should say the focus is really on licenses that cover a particular area, whether it be a town, a county, or a large region such as a state or multiple states. There is a whole separate licensing regime that focuses on the use of spectrum for point-to-point applications, and it's a great topic, but it's not the one I intend to focus on today. As we go through, I'll use in a number of cases an example of a wireless internet service provider. These are companies that compete with cable companies and the telcos to provide broadband wireless services in a particular region. But I know from looking at the attendee list that many of you actually come from different types of backgrounds. So by all means, as we go through, if you have questions, please use the Q&A tab, type in your question, and I'll either answer it right away, which is kind of my preference to make this a little bit more interactive, or if you have questions at the end, or if it just makes sense to delay that question until the end, that's fine too. Also, for that matter, if you have comments, if you want to, kind of raise your hand and say, "But what about?" and give your perspective, I think that will make this a more interesting discussion as we go through here. We're targeting 45 minutes, including Q&A, so I'll try and move pretty quickly. There is a lot of content here, but by all means, I think it's more interesting if it gets interactive. So, the first topic we'll cover is why would you ever pay for something that's something free, that others use for free, or that you can use for free, and talk about the relative advantages of owning that license. We'll talk about trends, what's going on in licensed wireless, some bands that are of interest. Only certain portions of the radio frequency band are appropriate for broadband wireless, according to the FCC, and whether, in fact, any of those might be available in your area of operations. They generally are, but there certainly are cases where it's very difficult to acquire a spectrum license in a particular area. We'll talk about cost ranges. This varies pretty significantly, although I make the argument that in general spectrum should never be the dominant cost of any wireless system. And then talk about next steps and some Q&A. So that's the plan we have in terms of going through the discussion. All right, why would you ever buy something that when you can license spectrum when you can get unlicensed for free? Well, the first reason is, of course, there is congestion on the unlicensed bands when many operators, many entities are using those for a variety of purposes. The FCC gives a broad range of potential uses, though they do set the power limit low to try to minimize the total interference. If you have locations where your customers or the points you want to serve do not have line of sight to a tower, then in the licensed arena, you can still use the additional power, the lower frequencies that are generally available to reach those customers, at least over reasonable distances up to a few miles. You have additional capacity beyond what can be served from the unlicensed environment. And of course, you don't have the concern that a link that it works today for a particular customer is going to cease working at some point in the future when somebody else starts to use the same unlicensed band. So all of those are significant advantages to licensed spectrum. And I guess it just generally adds one more tool that you can use to serve your customers. So it gives you the full range, and you don't have the situation where you arrive at a customer location, the customer's already signed up for service, they're ready to pay, they expect the thing to work, and you're unable to serve them because you don't have line of sight. So it's a significant advantage. What my clients tell me is, particularly those clients who have both licensed and unlicensed operation, perhaps they started out in the unlicensed business and then have moved more recently into licensed, is they have reduced operating complexity, reduced operating expense when they're operating in a licensed versus unlicensed environment. And so there are real ongoing savings from that advantage. The more capital-rich or aggressive providers are starting to look to mobility. I think in many cases, the discussion we're having about licensed spectrum is spectrum that could be used for either fixed or mobile. In urban environments, such as what Clearwire and Sprint are serving, they're attempting to provide mobile services to mobile devices, mobile broadband devices, 4G devices. But in more rural territories, we see people operating initially in fixed environments with the opportunity to begin to add portability or mobility as their customer base builds. I think the price for 2.5 gigahertz equipment in particular is going to be headed down. And when we look at it, there's something like 2.5 million fixed subscribers for unlicensed wireless ISP service in the United States today. Obviously, a much higher volume when you start to include indoor-type services of so-called Wi-Fi type service. But China Mobile has selected this 2.5 gigahertz band. They're going to deploy what they call long-term evolution in a time division format. We'll come to what that means later. My prediction is 100 million subscribers in China using this spectrum band, the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum band with licensed equipment. And you know that the way they're going to get to those numbers is by driving costs very low. So, significant opportunity to drive revenues and hopefully at reduced costs over time. Although today, your getting started costs with licensed are probably higher than with unlicensed. So why else consider, from a business perspective, licensed spectrum? Well, I can't think of better collateral than a spectrum license. It doesn't depreciate. You can't use it up, and it's easily resellable. So the banks love this stuff. Investors in general. I believe that the company, if there's a couple of companies offering unlicensed service, and one of them also adds licensed wireless to their capabilities, the performance advantages will give them a competitive advantage, and over time, that entity stands to win in the marketplace. Beyond that, and we'll talk about this more, many of the licenses in the 2.5 gigahertz band, in fact, about 5/8 of the licenses, it's about 200 megahertz available. More than half of that was licensed to educational institutions who in most cases don't use it for their own purposes, but instead lease it out to commercial operators. So if financing is an issue for your company, if you're trying to figure out how to grow your business without having to pay exorbitant rates to investors or lenders, then instead of buying the spectrum, you can rent it. And that, I think, provides a significant advantage to younger growing companies. As I mentioned, Clearwire has probably the control of the majority of the spectrum in the 2.5 gigahertz band. Clearwire is a public company, majority owned by Sprint. They're focused now on the urban areas, on delivering wholesale long-term evolution 4G service in those urban areas. And so far not really focused on building out. I mean, they've preserved their licenses. They're meeting the bare minimum FCC requirements in the rural areas, but not really building those areas out. So if your company, acquires a spectrum license and or leases a spectrum license and starts to build out and has some customers, I think there's a very real future possibility of affiliating either with other companies like yours around the country, or potentially with Sprint Clearwire to have more of a roaming and affiliation kind of a service, where their customers could come and use your network and vice versa. And of course, spectrum prices are low compared to historical numbers, particularly true in the 2.5 gigahertz band, where in most of the history there's been competition between different entities to acquire this spectrum. In 2008, Sprint put its spectrum assets into Clearwire, and so at least in the major cities there's no significant competition for this spectrum now, and there's starting to be some, I guess I'd say, in some of the more rural areas, but still prices are low compared to where they were in the maybe half or a third what they were in the 2006-2007 time frame. So we can anticipate that with growing demand for broadband usage, Cisco and others generally believe that broadband demand is growing at a rate of doubling on an annual basis. And it may slow down some, but still you can see exponential growth. In the meantime, the supply, at least of spectrum, is moving at Washington pace, and that is certainly not exponential growth. It's not exponential change. I think the FCC is doing the best they can. They put out a national broadband plan that said that they intended to make 500 megahertz of spectrum available over the next 10 years. Well, that plan came out early in 2010, so we're more than 2 years since then. So far, I'd argue that the only new spectrum that's been made available is the WCS band. That's a 25 to 30 megahertz, depending on how you count. And it's really not even new. They just kind of changed the rules to make it slightly more friendly for wireless broadband. So, they're not on a path to accomplish 500 megahertz in 10 years yet. The biggest opportunity is to take back some of the UHF television channels. Congress has actually passed a law that will allow that to happen. Most think that that'll take many years to actually accomplish. I've heard 6 to 10 years as a kind of a forecast of how long it'll take to accomplish that. So at a time when demand is growing rapidly, supply of spectrum is not growing rapidly. There are other ways to meet demand for additional capacity in wireless networks. They all require capital. They all require investment. And so spectrum, I think, is going to continue to be a source of increasing demand, and logically, prices should increase over time. Okay. If we look at what trends, what are we seeing that's happening in the spectrum market per se? By the way, I see here a question about Clearwire's equipment, and I will go ahead and try and answer that partially now, and we can probably come to it more later. Clearwire, at the moment, in the WiMAX arena, which was their initial deployment, has used at least Huawei and Samsung, I think also Motorola. There may be additional suppliers as well in terms of their infrastructure equipment. You can probably look on their webpage and see the actual device side of what they've used. They have a significant conversion now as they move to start to deploy LTE, and if they've announced what equipment they're using there, I've not seen that announcement yet. So coming back to the spectrum markets here, in the rural markets, we have seen some entities that had, I think, kind of hoped to be Clearwire affiliates, or they had plans that were to do in rural markets similar service to what Clearwire was offering in major markets. Xanadu, Highbeam, and Digital Bridge have all recently sold or in the process of selling spectrum rights. Highbeam was my client; the other two are not. Other companies are buying spectrum rights. All three of these companies, Northeast Wireless, Speed Connect, Main Street, are examples, and there are certainly others. Were founded on the expectation of using primarily licensed spectrum. So this is completely consistent with their plan, and they're expanding their coverage over time. Northeast Wireless started with more of a cellular kind of a play, and they're expanding into wireless broadband. The others were more in the broadband arena. But the other thing that we're seeing in smaller markets is the unlicensed companies, the wireless ISPs, acquire spectrum. So Casair was my client in Michigan. There's two Whispers, one in Illinois, the other in Tennessee and now Arkansas. And New Wave Netcorp is also a Northern Illinois company, Kansas Broadband. That's self-explanatory. But I'm seeing lots more interest from these companies as they reach the point where they're successful, they have profits, they want to grow, they're looking for more reliable operations, they're looking for better financing, all of the reasons mentioning on the earlier slides to acquire these licensed spectrums and spectrum rights. I think it's worth mentioning that even if you're not in the business of providing commercial broadband, that licensed spectrum rights can give you advantages. So I have recommended this to utilities who are looking to do smart grid, to companies that are just intending to provide, say, coverage of an oil field or something like that with highly reliable communications. There's other applications besides competition with the cable and the telephone company. But this is where we've seen most of the interest so far. So now talking a little bit about overall what bands might be of interest to companies looking to deploy wireless broadband systems. It's not just 2.5 gigahertz, although that is the direction that many of my clients have gone. It's certainly the direction where I've done the most of the transactions. 700 megahertz and AWS are both, primarily major wireless carrier bands. They are owned by some of the smaller wireless carriers as well in the more rural territory. 700 megahertz made a lot of news in 2007 when they held a $21 billion auction, and some of the prices that the spectrum went for, particularly in the major cities, were very, very high. It was a record prices in terms of what was accomplished there. This is the band that is expected to be what Verizon and AT&T are using to deploy their LTE, their initial deployments of LTE. They will also be deploying LTE, this so-called fourth generation capability in the advanced wireless service band. 700 is interesting in that it's mostly paired, but not entirely. So when we talk about paired spectrum, it's maybe not a term that everybody is used to hearing. It's worth mentioning just briefly. Historically, all two-way wireless systems utilized a different frequency for uplink and for downlink. They were close, but they had a narrow gap in between them, and that allowed simultaneous transmit and receive without the issue of interference between the transmit side and the receive side. So that's how the original cell phone services were built, and that's how military systems were built, and pretty much everything that was two-way went in that way until really the last maybe decade or so. And that's when companies realized two things. One is communications happening at the speed of light. Spectrum is precious. Maybe we can use the same channel for uplink and downlink and just take turns. Obviously, very fast repetition and lots of information going up and then lots of information coming down. And by the way, if we do it that way, then we have the flexibility to change the ratio of uplink to downlink, because in the internet environment in particular, there is more information traveling to the subscribers than from the subscribers. This is asymmetrical, kind of entertainment-driven. If you're watching Netflix on your portable device or in your home, obviously much more information is coming on the downlink. So the time division duplex approach, ping-pong with more information coming down than up, and buffering to smooth all that out, has come into more common use within the world, and it is the form that mostly is used in the 2.3 and especially the 2.5 gigahertz band. Theoretically, the FCC will allow you to use paired operation, but it requires acquiring enough spectrum to match the uplink and the downlink. And in general, I think most companies that have deployed in 2.5 gigahertz have done it using time division duplex modes of operation. So the other two bands worth mentioning here for wireless broadband are the WCS band at 2.3 gigahertz. That sits on either side of Sirius XM satellite radio, and therefore there are some interference concerns, particularly with the so-called C and D block that is in the middle of that 2.3 gigahertz band. But it is potentially available nearly nationally. The entities that have it would, I think, like to sell it. And then the BRS and EBS, the so-called 2.5 gigahertz band, is the one I mentioned and has been kind of the focus of this talk. It's also been really the place where there has been more fixed broadband wireless deployed, and I'd say probably more subscribers using this band for broadband wireless than any other bands so far, with potentially Verizon and AT&T catching up quickly as they deploy their 4G systems. So, all of this is kind of interesting, but if there's none in your area, it maybe becomes a lot less so. Inside the major cities, there is spectrum left, but it's hard to get because it's mostly in the hands of the major carriers, and they mostly don't want to part with it. And, they have plans to use it if they're not using it already. As you get to the secondary markets, the tertiary markets, and the rural markets, still the spectrum is typically held by entities that are in the wireless business. They're much more likely to be willing to part with it or to trade for it. There's a lot of trading that goes on between the major operators. But there is some on the secondary market, and you'll see prices here on the next page that kind of give you an idea of what these trade for. And also, at least in the 2.5 gigahertz space, there is some white space, unlicensed area, that the FCC may be making available later this year. And that's a significant opportunity, I think, for companies that would like to get into licensed spectrum. Certainly an area to watch is, how will the FCC make that available? This white space that I'm talking about in 2.5 gigahertz is essentially all reserved for educational entities, and as I mentioned before, they are allowed to lease it out. And if you form a partnership, leasing partnership with one of these educational entities, you could encourage them to apply to get the spectrum, and then once they have that license, to lease the capacity to a commercial operation. So, how much does this cost? I've said, well, it could be billions in the case of 700 megahertz and, nationwide and all of the carriers. But what about, a real-world example of what does it cost in your service area? Well, the original educational broadband 2.5 gigahertz was licensed in areas of about 35-mile radius circle. In some cases, the edges of that were cut off where circles overlap, and you have a kind of flat spot between the two adjacent licenses. But they don't look all that much different than the bagels on the right-hand side of the page there. They're just 35 miles around. If in a rural area, it's not unusual for a license of 35 miles to cover about 100,000 people. That's typically some smaller towns included in that. The 3/4 of that typical license would be 16.5 megahertz. That would be 3 of the 4 channels. It happens to be the ones that are contiguous and therefore most useful for wireless broadband. And obviously, the more megahertz, the more valuable it would be. If you multiply the 100,000 people by 16.5 megahertz, you get 1.65 million megahertz pops. At a nickel per megahertz pop, that would be a license that's worth $82,500. And the nickel, by the way, is an example price. Certainly they go higher or lower depending on the particular negotiating situation, supply-demand in that transaction. That, could be a one-time check that you write, or it could be just an annual lease payment of $7,800, that boils down to $650 a month. If you're getting $50 a month per subscriber, that's a baker's dozen. That's 13 subscribers. So within 100,000 service area, I make the argument that it's a relatively inexpensive license. And certainly you having this license would give you the capability to serve a lot more people than not having it. In a successful business, you'd have hundreds or more likely thousands of subscribers in that service area. So Spectrum should be the low cost and should enable the business to succeed with the equipment and other requirements of running a business. So that's the nickel per megahertz pop example, which is probably appropriate in rural areas for either WCS or BRS EBS. 700 megahertz in AWS have better propagation. They're lower frequency. 700 megahertz in particular penetrates much better through terrain obstacles and through the walls of buildings. Those prices are also higher because they're being competed for by the mobile companies. In some cases, multi-billion-dollar corporations. But this is a range of what you'll see in terms of spectrum values overall, and it kind of gives you an idea of how do you want to shoot on the very high performance as opposed to relatively low cost scale. So hopefully all of this has encouraged you to look more seriously at licensed spectrum, or at least given you a perspective on what it's all about. In terms of looking for more information, I definitely recommend the Wireless Communication Association International, WCAI.com, I think is their website. And that has historically been the trade association for commercial operators in the 2.3 and 2.5 gigahertz band. The Rural Cellular Association will help with some of these other frequency bands that I mentioned, and is generally a good source of information. Of course, the FCC has a wealth of information on their website. Sometimes navigating that can be a little bit of a challenge, but I definitely recommend looking there as well. And you'll find, if you want to pick up the phone and try and find the right person at the FCC, they will do their best to be helpful. So I recommend that as well. If you want to shortcut some of that and pay the money and go with either an attorney or a spectrum broker, obviously as a broker I recommend that, and there are many qualified FCC attorneys, most of them located inside the Beltway here in the Washington D.C. area, but also a few spread around the country who can help you sort through what these alternatives are. With that, I'd like to go ahead and turn the rest of the presentation here over to Travis. He can briefly talk about what equipment Moonblink supports, and also he's going to be moderating the Q&A session.